Chapter 1. The voice of the calling in the silence of the camp, when the stars had barely touched the dark onyx dome of the night sky, piercing the gloom with their silver needles, Moses heard a voice. It was not the voice that thundered like lightning over Sinai, splitting the stone peaks, nor the one that swept as wind during the day's journey. No, this voice did not issue from the scorching desert, but from the depths of eternity, from the very heart of existence, penetrating not the ears, but the most secret recesses of the soul, where the people's hopes and fears were stored. It pierced Moses' essence like a sacred sword, separating truth from shadow. It was a calling that summoned him to absolute, uncompromising purity. God spoke of those who willingly, out of an unbearable inner thirst, gave themselves entirely to him, the Nazirites. The word Nazir resonated like a brass bell, meaning separated, consecrated, pure. They were not merely believers among believers. They were the living boundary that divided the secular from the sacred, man from heaven. They were souls consumed in the flame of dedication, wrenching themselves out of the general flow of life, where the clay of needs mixed with the sand of desires, to become a crystal clear spring available only to one, the Creator. Their vow was a personal, individual Sinai. Everyone who embarked on this path transformed their physical shell into the likeness of the tabernacle of the covenant, where the invisible fire must burn incessantly. Their separation was not an escape from the people, but a sacrificial service to them, as if the Nazirites, by their example, were saying, "There is a place among you where God lives directly, and that place is the heart." This voice, quiet yet sovereign, permeated Moses' soul with the realization of how dramatic a choice human beings possess. The law of the Nazirite was given in a context of freedom. It was not compulsion, but the gift of choice. No one had the right to force a son or daughter of Israel to take this vow. It was born only from inner will, like a cry of love, an irresistible desire to repay the Creator with a portion of their time, their physical strength, and an inexhaustible store of life. Moses heard not only the instructions, but also God's deep longing for absolute fidelity, a longing that could only be quenched by voluntary sacrificial separation. And he understood that the Nazirites were living lighthouses, placed amidst the endless wilderness of human life, so that even in the darkest hour, the people would know the path to purity exists, and it passes through voluntary self-limitation and consecration. Chapter 2. The essence of the vow. The Nazirite is not merely a person who performs a ritual. He is a metaphysical category. He is a soul consumed in the flame of dedication, transforming his physical being into a silent yet eloquent act of worship. The essence of his vow was woven from 3 threads, intertwining into an unbreakable cable that held him above the abyss of the mundane. The first thread, not to touch wine. This was not just a refusal of the intoxicating beverage that eases the burden of existence and brings temporary relief from worry. No, it was a refusal of all intoxication, spiritual, sensual, and intellectual. Wine symbolized relaxation, frivolity, the ability to forget the sublime for the sake of the earthly. The Nazirite, however, sought constant sobriety of spirit, a sharp mind always ready to meet God. His consciousness had to be crystal clear, so that every whisper of eternity would not drown in the noise of earthly passions. His heart was the altar, where the fire of unwavering faith burned, where there was no room for the smoke of illusions. It was a conscious choice in favor of inner control, in favor of a painful but necessary clarity. The second thread, not to cut the hair. This seemingly simple external sign was in reality the deepest symbol of his fidelity. The long, uncut hair became the visible sign of his invisible, inner covenant. It was like a crown that fell upon his shoulders, a golden or black waterfall, testifying that this person belonged to another. The hair, growing without restraint, was a measure of time, a measure of faithfulness, a measure of sacrificial service. Every centimeter of length was a testimony to a day lived in purity. Every lock a silent prayer. His eyes, a mirror of humility that reflected not the fleeting images of the world, but only the unyielding determination to keep the vow. He gave his strength, his natural beauty, his time to God, allowing these signs to grow as faith grows, invisibly but inevitably. It was a living, constant challenge to a culture that sought to control and trim even the smallest manifestations of natural power. The third thread, the most tragic, not to touch the dead. This prohibition demanded the greatest internal struggle from the Nazirite. Death is an inevitable element of human life, and not touching the dead meant separating oneself from the deepest grief and familial duty. Not even the death of the closest person, father, mother, brother, or sister, allowed him to break the vow. This was the apotheosis of separation. The Nazirite could not afford the luxury of ordinary human sorrow, which requires touching cold skin, a final farewell. His purity was holier than tears. His service was higher than family ties. In that moment, he was not merely a son or a brother. He was a living tabernacle. And just as death could not be brought into the tabernacle, so his body temple had to remain untouched by decay. This part of the vow was the source of the sharpest inner conflict, but it was precisely this that sanctified his solitude and elevated his vow to a level of cosmic significance. Chapter 3. The Path of Separation. In the camp of Israel, moving through the endless sands, amidst the noise of commerce, the cries of children, and the groans of camels, people spoke of such individuals with reverence mixed with awe. The Nazirites were like living monuments, hewn from a different, harder stone. Their separation was not a physical distance, but a metaphysical one. They did not live for themselves. Their existence was filled with a high duty. Every hour of their day was filled with prayer, silence, service, everything that required internal discipline, incomprehensible to the majority. Their days flowed to a rhythm different from the frantic pace of the camp. While everyone rushed to gather manna, the Nazirite sought to gather equally important sustenance: silence. Every morning began with a sacred stillness, when the Nazirite, gazing into the eastern sky, sought not just the face of God, but the reflection of his own fidelity in the purity of the morning light. He prayed, but his prayer was not a request, but a deep devotion, as long as his hair. In silence, he sought answers to questions others dared not even ask, about the meaning of suffering, the reason for their exile, the ultimate goal of their journey. This path of separation was not easy. People, observing their absence from general amusements, their restraint in speech, often felt awkward. Some considered them arrogant, others fanatics, but most understood. These people had taken on a burden too heavy for the general populace. They became the spiritual tuning forks of the camp. Their purity was an indicator of how far the entire nation had strayed from Sinai. When a Nazirite passed, people lowered their voices. hid unclean dishes, and tried to speak of pure things. His presence was a living reproach, and at the same time, a living hope. Even in work, which was inevitable, the Nazirite acted differently. He did not seize the most profitable task. He performed what was necessary with such diligence and humility that even the mundane cutting of wood or carrying of water became an almost meditative sacred act. There was a wholeness in his movement that was lacking in others, torn between desires and duty. The path of separation is a path of solitude, sanctified by purpose. In silence, he found strength, and in the constant reminder of his vow, an inexhaustible source of energy. His life was a continuous sermon, written not in ink on parchment, but woven from daily, unseen acts of selflessness. He was the hope of Israel. If this one person could live in such purity, then the entire nation could rise to that level. Chapter 4. Temptation and Purity. But the path of dedication is always a path of struggle, not easy triumph. The desert tolerates no illusions, and it tested the Nazirites with the same cruelty with which the sun scorches the shadow. Many, having taken the vow in the flame of initial inspiration, later faced temptations that penetrated the soul like hot sand. Some heard the whisper of wine, which was not just a desire to drink. It was the temptation of normality, the desire to shed the burden of constant spiritual sobriety, to enjoy the fleeting, simple joy shared by all. At night, when the lights went out, the Nazirite might stand near a tent where laughter echoed and fresh grape juice, now intoxicating, wafted, feeling his throat constrict from the dryness, not just of the desert, but of his own self-imposed limitation. It was a battle against relaxation, against the right to frivolity. His inner fire had to be stronger than external comfort. Others succumbed to the temptation of fame. The long hair that distinguished the Nazirite attracted attention. People came for advice, asked for blessings, looked at him with admiration. And then the silver sin, pride, could be born in his heart. He began to see himself not as a servant of the covenant, but as superior to others. This was the subtlest and most insidious temptation, for it was masked as religious zeal. The Nazirite could fall without breaking any external prohibition, yet losing the essence of the vow, humility. But the most difficult trial was death. Death is the black shadow that sooner or later touches every tent. When a loved one departed into the darkness of non-existence, tears flowed not only in the camp, but also in the Nazirite's soul. He could not even touch the cold body to pay his last respects, could not enter the tent where the spirit of decay lingered. This was a luxury forbidden to him. The Nazirite had to stand at the border of sorrow, separated by only a few steps from his dearest person, feeling the sharp pain of rupture. His purity was holier than tears, for it was the pledge of restoration, the promise of life in the face of death. He had to remember that his body was not his own, but the dwelling place of the Holy Spirit, which must not be defiled by decay. This pain of separation was his true daily sacrifice. When he turned away from the dead, he was actually turning away from the temptation of despair, confirming that his life belonged only to the source of eternity. Chapter 5. The Symbol of Hair. The long, uncut hair of the Nazirite was like the quiet language of heaven, a whisper heard only by those who are ready to listen with the heart. This was not merely an aesthetic choice. It was the sacred symbol of his inner flame, his Nazirite crown that covered his head. The hair became an extension of his prayer, his external manifesto that could not be hidden, constantly reminding both him and everyone around him of his vow. In the desert, where everything was mutable, the sands, the water, and even human moods, the Nazirite's hair was a symbol of permanence, a living narrative of time. Every lock, every curl, every strand that fell upon his shoulders was a written chapter of his spiritual journey. It was his connection to earth and heaven simultaneously. It grew from his body, yet was dedicated to the Creator. While all men cut their hair for order and convenience, the Nazirite allowed his strength to grow, transforming it into a symbol of complete dependence on God. His strength was not in his muscles, but in this symbol, as in Samson. But for most Nazirites, the strength was not physical, but purely spiritual. But sometimes the hair became his hardest trial, for if he accidentally defiled himself, if sin or decay touched him, he had to shave his hair, losing the symbol of his dedication, and begin the path anew, from scratch. This was the terrible cost of transgression, to lose the physical evidence of his fidelity, a kind of crown of holiness, and to stand before the community with a head that, only yesterday, was adorned with the crown of consecration, but was now a sign of his failure and need for purification. And when the time of dedication came to an end, whether after 30 days or years, the most solemn and dramatic moment arrived. The Nazirite shaved his head at the entrance to the tabernacle, not in the noisy camp, but at the sacred threshold. He was not merely cutting his hair, he was shaving off his vow. All his temptations, all his victories, all his days, they were gathered in these locks. He offered the hair as a sacrifice, throwing it into the fire that burned under the peace offering, a sign that everything, even beauty, even strength, even his solitude and his glory, belonged to God. The shaven hair symbolized the completion of his individual, separate path. Henceforth, he returned to the people, but not as he was. He returned renewed, with a heart that had passed through the fire of self-limitation. It was the moment when internal holiness passed into external service, and the symbol vanished, leaving behind only the essence. Chapter 6. The sacrifice of consecration. The final act of dedication was not merely a ritual, but the culmination of an internal drama enacted throughout the term of the vow. The Nazirite came to the tabernacle burdened not only by his long hair, but also by the invisible weight of his lived experience, the struggle with wine, temptations, and the grief of death. He brought his offerings, a complete offering consisting of 3 parts: a lamb without blemish for a burnt offering, symbolizing complete surrender and sacrifice, a ewe lamb for a sin offering, cleansing him from all accidental sins committed during the vow, and a ram for a peace offering, which was a feast of unity with God. But the bread held a special place, a basket of unleavened bread and unleavened cakes, anointed with oil. This was the bread of the Nazirite, symbolizing his bodily essence, purified from leaven, sin, and sanctified by oil. He did not just bring products, he brought a choice. Every element of the sacrifice was the voice of his heart. From his soul poured a breath of gratitude louder than any request. The priest, whose hands were accustomed to the sacred fire, laid them upon the Nazirite's head. This was a bridge connecting heaven and earth. In this moment, the minister took spiritual responsibility for the fulfillment of the vow and prayerfully transferred its result to the Creator. Smoke ascended. Above the tabernacle, which was not merely the product of burning meat and wood, but smoke that carried a prayer transformed into an aroma. Then the Nazirite shaved his hair and threw it into the fire under the peace offering, the highest act of transferring his strength. And finally, the priest took the boiled shoulder of the ram, one unleavened cake and one unleavened wafer, placed them on the Nazirite's hands, and then waved them before the Lord. This act of waving is a dynamic act of consecration, recognizing that all his powers, his labor, his beauty, the shoulder, the bread, were lifted up by God and returned to man for a new sanctified life. It was a moment of unity with the human soul, burdened and cleansed, touched the glory of God. Henceforth, the Nazirite became an ordinary Israelite, but with an extraordinary memory. He carried within himself the seal of the fire that had consumed his hair. His inner world was changed forever, and he returned to the camp as a witness that man can live in the world, yet not be its slave. Chapter 7. The spiritual essence of the vow Naziriteship is not about refusal, but about a radical, dramatic choice. It was not a list of prohibitions that restricted life, but a manifesto of inner freedom. Naziriteship is the choice to be pure when the world around you is shrouded in temptation. It is the choice to be separate when everyone strives to merge into a single, often mindless, collective current. The spiritual essence of the vow lay in the creation of an internal tabernacle. The physical tabernacle of the covenant was stationary. It served as the meeting point between God and his people. The Nazirite, however, transformed his own body into a mobile tabernacle that could travel through the desert. His hair was its covering, his sobriety, the golden lampstand that burned incessantly, and his heart, the ark where the invisible covenant was stored. The Nazirite taught the people that purity is not a place, but a state of the soul. He was living proof that a deep spiritual connection could be achieved without external mediation, without daily sacrifices, without constantly dwelling at the altar. His service was direct. He proclaimed, "My temple is myself, and my priest is my conscience." This was a path to the heart of God through silence, prayer, and absolute fidelity. The Nazirite's silence was louder than a sermon. It was filled not with fear, but with presence. He did not flee the world. He penetrated the world, carrying within himself this other dimension, the dimension of sanctified solitude. Naziriteship was an exercise in metaphysical responsibility. His mistake was not just his personal failure, but a threat to the purity of his temple. Every Nazirite became a living sign that God seeks those who are ready to listen to him, even amidst the storm, even amidst the noise of commerce, even amidst the laughter and tears of the camp. He was the antithesis of mass thinking, a model of individual spiritual valor. His presence in society was a constant, unavoidable reminder. There is a price to pay for hearing the voice, and that price is oneself. Chapter the 8. The Vow and Time. The Nazirite vow was as flexible as clay, but as hard as fired brick. There was Naziriteship for a few days, when the soul, exhausted by grave sin or simply daily vanity, needed swift, intensive purification and restoration of connection with God. It was a spiritual stop, a departure from the world to return to it with renewed strength. It resembled a short but deep breath of life. There was Naziriteship for years, demanding almost heroic endurance from the person. To imagine oneself living for decades without touching the fruit of the vine, constantly maintaining purity and allowing the hair to grow until it covered him like a mantle. This required immense inner resilience. This was the path of daily, invisible victory. But there was also a vow that lasted a lifetime. Some were born under the sign of this vow, like Samson, the warrior of God, whose hair was not just a vow, but the source of mystical strength. His life, a sacrifice, a song of fidelity that does not fade. Yet his fall became a tragic testament to how closely strength and symbol are intertwined. When his vow was broken, his hair shorn, his strength evaporated like dew under the sun, leaving him vulnerable to his enemies. Samson became a dramatic example. Naziriteship is not a trick, but fidelity. Or Samuel, the prophet who heard the voice of God from childhood. He was dedicated to God by his mother, Hannah, even before birth. His Naziriteship was rooted in his identity. It was not a choice, but a destiny. His life was a quiet yet resolute service that became the foundation for the restoration of Israel after the era of the Judges. Their lives were a living covenant that did not fade. They became points of support, spiritual rocks upon which the collective conscience of the people rested. They proved that time set aside for God is never wasted. On the contrary, time sanctified by the vow became the most valuable, most meaningful period of life. Nazirite transformed the flow of time, which constantly threatened to bring forgetfulness, into a slow, conscious march toward eternity. Chapter 9. The Consecration of Generations. Moses, standing at the threshold of the Promised Land, transmitted this law to Israel not as another item on a list of commandments, but as a holy, life-giving memory. He knew that a people who loses the memory of the pure, the separate, the holy, is like a body without a soul, condemned to decay and dissolution. Naziriteship was a law that resisted the entropy of the spirit. He understood that most of the people would neither be able nor willing to live in such constant, exhausting purity. But it was vitally necessary that this possibility exist, that this highest standard be present. Therefore, the Nazirites became the spiritual elite, not through lineage, but through choice. Anyone could join them, setting aside their social status and becoming simply separated. This was the most democratic and most severe spiritual hierarchy. The Israelites were to remember that every time someone willingly took the Nazirite vow, a quiet yet profound song resonated in the camp. For they knew there was again one among them who embodied the holiest ideal of the law. It was a song of joy and gratitude. This person became a spiritual protector, whose purity, like an invisible wall, shielded the entire nation from the wrath of God. The law of the Nazirite was handed down to generations as a covenant of hope. It testified that even when priests might weaken and kings might sin, there would always be a man or woman who would say, "I choose the voice." They walked before God face to face, transforming their ordinary life into a mystical dialogue. They were proof that the covenant is not a dead word, but a living, active force. When old Nazirites completed their vow, young Israelites saw in their eyes not fatigue, but deep, unshakable peace. They saw their hair burn on the altar and understood. This was not the end, but the beginning. This was the message to generations. True strength is in devotion. True freedom is in self-limitation. And this living, burning memory guaranteed that the fire of faith in Israel would never go out. Chapter Eggs. Silence after consecration. When the Nazirite completed his days of dedication, he walked into a silence that was louder than any cry. It was not a triumphal march, but an entry into a new life. No one saw him weep or pray in his tent after his hair had burned on the altar. That path was between him and God, and only those two knew the true price of the journey. The final sacrifice was offered, the ritual completed, and now he had to learn again to live amidst the noise, but no longer succumbing to it. His changed identity was invisible but profound. He returned to ordinary life. He could drink wine again, cut his hair, and touch the dead. But his heart bore the seal burned by the fire of the vow. His hair, offered in sacrifice, burned slowly, like silence ascending to heaven. It was his gift, his physical embodiment of fidelity, transforming into smoke that carried gratitude and love. The smoke of the Nazirite sacrifice was unique. It was not just about purification, but about achievement. And when the last smoke dissipated over the tabernacle, mingling with the boundless desert sky, the Nazirite's heart knew God had accepted his gift. This was not knowledge from external signs, but a deep, unshakable, internal realization. He received a peace more valuable than any reward. His solitude was complete, yet his inner fullness remained. He became a witness that man can dedicate himself to the Creator, and this dedication does not destroy, but rather completes the person. He returned to the camp, carrying within himself an invisible radiance that was silent yet eloquent proof. Holiness is possible.